I don't like saying it, but she was constantly tormenting me. You know what I mean? I went to the garage and got the hatchet out. I shouldn't have. Why? I was thinking that. I called my mom. Said, I don't know what the hell to do.
What did you actually tell your mom?
I had a little problem. You know what I mean? I killed my girlfriend in my house. Like, she was at me ever since after work. And I was like, it. Somehow or another, it popped into my mind to kill her.
What happened?
I went to the garage and got the hatchet out. I shouldn't have. Why? I was thinking that. I was like, damn. Actually, I was going to get an axe, but the only thing was there was a little small hatchet. And that's what I used. God, man. And I came in, and next thing you know, she's like, son of a or something.
And then what did you do?
I was thinking somehow or another make one quick sweep, you know what I mean? It wound up disastrous.
What was the first part of her body that you hit?
Probably the neck.
He was high on cocaine. He was fairly heavily intoxicated, it appears. And so his impulsivity would have been increased. Yet, when he didn't find an axe, that wasn't the signal to just retract and back away from that plan and use it as a cooling off to just get away from her. He then sees a hatchet, and he gets the bright idea to kill her with the hatchet. So there's still some organization to his thought process, even though he wants to believe and hold on to the idea that the drugs made him do it.
He's very blasé as he's discussing it.
I knew that I hurt her, right? And I couldn't change that. What the am I supposed to do? Just leave her suffering or something? I don't know, man. It was bad. You know what I mean? Irreversible. She got up and mumbled. Then I thought, oh, you know what I mean? What the, you know? And I was like, I was trying to waste her.
How many times would you say that you hit her?
10 times. 10.
10 times.
At least. She's looking at me and tried to escape to the other end of the couch.
The word escape is interesting. It has some meaning, I think, that is deeper and more relevant. And his concern is that she was escaping, but you don't escape after you've been hit in the neck with an axe or a hatchet to the other end of a couch. That's not an escape.
What we know is that the girlfriend was finally going to leave him, and he was aware of that, and there had been an argument that night. Psychopaths like to stay in control of their situation. They have, in many regards, pretty fragile egos. They don't handle rejection well, and having her leave him is not a reality he likely would have accepted.
Was Jennifer present in the room when you were actually striking Becky with the hatchet?
Yes, she was. She was. She came down the steps and made like a scream or something like that. I don't know what she said, but I knew already it was too late. And I was very pressured because I didn't want her to suffer.
I don't think he was worried about the mother suffering at all. I think this is another opportunity for him to use his glib and superficial charm and to present like he's being helpful. He's the hero. And it's very chilling when we're talking about somebody murdering their girlfriend in front of her daughter.
She started getting upset and crying. And I said, stop it. I made her sit in that single seat, right? I used a hatchet like one or two more times, and it was nothing, you know?
So Jennifer was sitting there when you used the hatchet for 1 or 2 more times?
I think so. I think so. Jennifer was just crying. I didn't know what to do with her. I said, don't make me mad.
Did you hit Jennifer?
I tried to knock her down. I wasn't sure what she was going to do. Like, run out. I didn't know what I was doing. I knew I was doing something wrong. She said, I think I've gotten Mom's blood on me. And I took Jennifer out of there and upstairs.
What did you say to her?
Just be good. Do as I say.
Did you ever tell her you want to kill her?
Jennifer? No. I said, well, maybe I can get away with this, you know.
Maybe you can get away with what?
Like it never happened.
Did you have any sex with Jennifer?
No.
Why do you think that Jennifer would mention that you had sex with her?
Because I'm lying, that's why. No, I'm lying. Yeah, I'm lying. That's why I lied to you, right? All right, so yeah, I did. I'm sorry. It's kind of embarrassing, that's why I did. I always liked her, you know, she's cute and all.
Did you ever tell her that you might have to kill her or anything of that nature?
No. Oh, yes, I did. I'm sorry, I did. I said, what am I gonna do now? You know about it. She goes, oh, no. I said, just kidding, just kidding.
He literally is laughing as he is talking about raping a 14-year-old girl. His narcissism is front and center here. His desire for control and his lack of remorse is astonishing, and also what we see in some psychopaths.
And who could do that? He's not pulling himself back. What he's doing is saying, well, what else can I do? I mean, there's a piece missing from this guy's psyche, that's for sure. There's a lot of very twisted and perverse behavior here, all based on rage.
What we know is that Jennifer convinces him to call his mother because she's in survival mode. And she's using a level of decision-making that is profound.
I called my mom. Said, I don't know what the hell to do.
What did you actually tell your mom?
I killed Becky. I said, you know, I had a wreck here, man, I don't know what to do. And then she said that she's gonna have the police come. And I said, well, okay, I agreed. And I said, I have blood on my pants. She said, change them then, you know what I mean? I didn't change them now. I went downstairs and I got Becky's pocketbook and gave that to Jennifer. And the car keys. So we're sitting on a porch. And I said, I'm sorry that my life is like this. This is weird. I said, I don't know why this happened like this to me. And I said, Jen, well, what do you think? I would take that car at about 120 miles an hour and head for her Mac job. She goes, the airbag will save you.
Were you thinking about taking Jennifer with you and committing suicide with her or anything of that nature?
I asked her would she like to go along, kiddingly. She goes, no. She knew I was kidding.
It's clearly outrageous that after subjecting this kid to this horrific whirlwind of violence, that he would be saying, like, woe is me, and then invite her to commit suicide with him. I mean, how is she supposed to respond to any of this? I mean, it's preposterous. And he's so selfish and so self-absorbed that he doesn't even grasp the enormity of what's just happened.
I was maintenance at the apartments. It must have been like a Thursday night. I went with a few friends in Somerset Towers, and we were snorting cocaine, partying pretty heavy, which lasted till 1 o'clock in the morning. For some reason, I took the stairs to the roof, and I went over to the edge of the roof, and I swung down onto the balcony of Dee Rosenthal's apartment.
For what purpose did you enter Miss Rosenthal's apartment?
Basically, I liked her. You know, I thought she was pretty nice, and I knew she lived alone.
So you basically went to see if you could have sex?
I was thinking maybe a sexual encounter. I was lured a little bit by her beauty.
The possibility that surprising someone in their own apartment because you find them attractive would result in a sexual encounter, it's preposterous. And he's pathetic and dangerous because when he's in this mode, he's capable of committing murder. When he gets it in his head and he's high enough, these cuckoo ideas are acted on. I think it does put him in the psychopathic spectrum. He's operating from the framework of like an infant, you know, like a teenager.
I entered the bedroom, and she was laying in bed on her back, and I was looking on her pure, and that's when she awoke. When she spotted me, she let out a scream. She saw me there in her bedroom, and I figured she knew who I was. And I was sure she was gonna make a lot of noise. So I jumped onto the bed, and I tried to cover her mouth with my hand so she wouldn't scream. She bit my hand. It was a good dig. But she just passed out. She slid from the bed to the floor next to the closet. So I held her nose and her mouth closed, and she stopped breathing. I knew that she had passed away. Maybe if she didn't say anything at all, I probably might have just left. I went to the kitchen, and I found $80 exactly in cash in her pocketbook. I took that.
He talks about essentially if she hadn't been attractive, he wouldn't have tried to enter her apartment and wanted to have sex with her. But he also actually says that essentially the reason he suffocated her is because she started screaming. She started protesting, and if she hadn't said anything, he likely would just have left. So I think that willingness to blame the victim like that and to do it in such a matter-of-fact way is some of that callous, cold nature that we see in psychopaths.
I unlocked the door so I could re-enter the apartment later. I waited till 2 or 3 in the morning and went back to the apartment. I wanted to take her from this apartment and hide her somewhere. So I took the fitted sheet off the bed, wrapped her in that, and I put her inside the shopping cart. And I peeked out to the hallway, nobody was around. Took her in a shopping cart, down and out the back door of the apartment complex. Of some sort, off of Route 130. There was a dirt road that you could drive back there, and the weeds were also 6 foot tall. I took her from the car, maybe 15 or 20 feet into the weeds, and left her there.
I still don't understand how somebody gets to do all these things. What, were you watching too much TV or what?
Oh, like why would I commit a murder?
Yes, yes.
I had an accident while I was 16 and a half. We were partying with marijuana a little bit. And it was at nighttime. Well, it was an accident. We took off.
You took off from that accident?
Yeah. And then I heard that announcement over the radio.
Yeah?
He said they were looking for somebody who had killed somebody's old lady. Automatically, my heart dropped. I thought that the car accident that I had up over there under the bridge,
Right?
that I had killed a woman driver.
So you thought of yourself as what?
As a killer.
But to this day, then, obviously you don't really know what happened, right?
I really don't know. But I understand that if I wanted to again, I can, you know?
Please, ma'am, it's a murder, ma'am. It's a murder, ma'am. Please come.
What's happening? So what exactly is happening there?
Ma'am, I tried to get in my sister's apartment all night last night, and nobody would answer. When we came this morning, the door was open, and she was in here dead.
I just started beating on it then with my hands and with the weapon I had.
And I had voices talking in my head the whole time. I'm supposed to be in the NBA. I'm supposed to be in the NFL.
I could have been Michael Jordan or somebody.
What do you want? I'm not going to say man. Hey! Get from out of here!
I knew what y'all did.
Get your ass out of there!
I know what y'all did.
Get out of there!
No, I know what y'all did.
What are you talking about? Hey, partner, what's going on? Step on out there.
Y'all know what y'all did to me, man.
Hey, step on out there. Come out. Just step out. Open the door.
I'll be fine if I come out.
Yes, yeah, you'll be fine. Open the door. Come out here.
From a behavioral standpoint, he's appearing like someone who's lost in his head and perhaps responding to delusional elements that we can't see or hear.
There's certainly a flavor of paranoia. He's making comments like, I know what you all have done to me, but it's unclear what he's really referring to. It's possible that this is all part of a ploy, that he wants to present himself as someone who's mentally ill.
How long have you had the current apartment together?
A few months.
Okay, so was it just you, the two of you and your daughter?
Right, and her brother.
Okay. Let's start off with last night. You were with Remy last night?
For a little while. Well, until the incident happened.
Will you be more specific as far as
what the incident is?
I just didn't want to be arguing with her
about the voices that I was hearing in my head, because I kept telling her, I'm not a failure, I'm not a failure, I'm not a failure, you know? And I wanted to prove it to her. I started hearing these voices in both of my ears, back to back.
Does he have a real mental illness, or is this part of an act?
what incident are you talking about that happened until the incident happened?
I ain't like the trick that they put on me.
Someone played a trick on you?
Yeah.
Who was that?
I believe it was her and her brother. They put some kind of voodoo tricks on me. And I had voices talking in my head the whole time. My mind was all messed up. It was all messed up.
What were you hearing?
All kinds of things. All kinds of things. All kinds of things.
Her and her brother did.
They Haitians.
If this is more psychopathy, less psychosis, this is the ultimate manipulation attempt, because he is using intelligence, his knowledge of symptoms of mental health conditions, and acting them out in order to be able to maintain his innocence.
Why stop at I'm hearing voices coming out of both ears when I can add in voodoo? Bynum sounds delusional, but he's trying to figure out, how do I play my cards? He's wanting to commit to feigning psychiatric symptoms, likely for a defense. It's not very compelling.
How did you guys end up going to blows?
I just want her to just confess what she did.
And what was her answer?
She just kept saying, what am I talking about? And I'm like, y'all know exactly what y'all did, so just go ahead and just tell me the truth. And she was saying, okay, I'll tell you, your mom did it to you. I'm like, what? Oh, man. I knew she was lying, though. Mm-hmm. I knew she was lying.
So 24 hours, not even, has passed. If somebody were to be experiencing hallucinations and have kind of delusions of voodoo, they're not going to be, short of being on an acid trip, they're not going to be referencing them 18 to 24 hours later, like, this is what I was thinking, this is what was going on, and now I'm kind of back to normal.
He is on track with the conversation. He's responding appropriately to the themes as they change in the conversation. And even though he's saying the voices, he's carrying on a coherent, meaningful conversation with them, and he doesn't exhibit the breakdown in the coherence of his thoughts from one thought to the next. We often call that a loosening of association or fragmented thinking that we do see in people who are hallucinating or have schizophrenia. So he appears to be putting on a show of suffering from hearing voices, but his presentation is so highly organized, we know he has an intact cognitive mind with which to interact with the world around him.
I just started beating on her with my hands and with the weapon I had.
The knife?
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that you were stabbing her or slicing her?
Both.
What was running through your mind when this was happening?
Just voices.
In the crime scene photos, it looks like wounds that are inflicted by somebody who's full of rage. It's not once, it's not twice, it's multiple times. The sheer volume and severity of the injuries is really stunning.
He is veering more into the psychopathic realm than the delusional realm. He had significantly mutilated her body. There's a level of rage and intent and deliberation to the act. For me, these all link to narcissistic rage.
You've probably not done this in the past, I'm assuming, right?
Not as as much as I have last night.
Okay. So this was a major event for you.
Oh, yeah.
I kept telling myself that I'm supposed to be in the NBA. I'm supposed to be in the NFL.
Did you play in school?
Yeah, I played in school.
Were you a star?
I wasn't the star, but I was a star on the team.
You were a star?
I could have been a star on the team if the ball was in my hand a lot, but the ball wasn't in my hand a lot. So they already had guys that could do that already.
The detective has his number. Let me get this guy talking about himself. His own ego will undo his ability to protect himself here. This guy seems very impressed with himself, despite a lack of achievements.
The most insulting thing to the narcissist is actually, in general, the real world. Most people can grow up and adjust, and they're mature. He's rather narcissistic.
He does strike me as somebody who's very angry about not having reached that potential. Perhaps she didn't believe in his grandiose, inflated sense of his abilities.
Oh my goodness, man. I could have been Michael Jordan or somebody.
Yeah, but he's washed up now.
At least Kobe.
At least Kobe? Did you get jealous when she talked about her love of Dwight Howard? Because you wanted to be that one she looked up to, the one she admired?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
She just didn't want to confirm it?
She'd just be like, yeah, I know. Yeah, I know.
So, how did she end up getting up out of the chair?
When I told her, what did she do to me? And why did she do it for? And that's when she stood up and started running her mouth. She's saying that I'm going crazy and what's wrong with you and you need to go to church and pray. And I'm like, nah, it's not about the church because I know I'm supposed to be a star in some major sport.
For people who are psychopaths, fantasy is more important than reality. But his girlfriend is not conforming to his fantasy, and that enrages him because it doesn't fit in his grand picture of himself. And it's not her fault, but in his mind, it is. So for her to say, now you're just talking crazy, would be a trigger to make him angry.
He feels disrespected when she's, quote, running her mouth. Someone who has psychopathic tendencies wants to be in control of the situation, and this perceived loss of control only fuels that rage. Whereas he couldn't do anything about his professional basketball playing, he can have control over this situation, and he did.
In the weeks leading up to the murder, there are numerous text messages back and forth between Bynum and Remy, or with commenting on from a psychiatric standpoint. Remy writes to him, "You know I love you, but things have to improve. You spit in my face. I'm getting tired of that." And Bynum responds, "What is you talking about? One moment you love me, the next moment you want me to leave." And Remy writes back a little bit later, "I thought it would be different." And Bynum responds, "Make a difference then, instead of talking and running your mouth." It is a threat to his narcissism to hear people giving him feedback, and then that moves him into behavior that's psychopathic.
This text indicates a failure of his accepting responsibility. Rather, it's her. Okay, well, then you make a difference. But we don't see any indication that he's actually recognizing that he's a contributor to their relationship problems.
This is another excerpt from a text exchange where Bynum is saying, "The mind games aren't going to work." And Remy responds by saying, "I'm not playing mind games. This is my life. What about you being wrong? Are you ever?" To which Bynum responds, "Sweetheart, God don't like ugly. He knows exactly what's going on and what's going to happen." He is manipulative, and this is the mind game that he's playing. She's going to conform to what he wants, and it's never his fault.
He does, in another text, make a sexual reference about how he could keep her mouth shut using sexually provocative language. And in that instance, it shows his attempt again to control that through sexual means.
In many cases with psychopathy and violence, sex doesn't become a pleasurable, intimate act between two people. It becomes something that's aggressive and violent and done to the other person, either to put them down or shut them up.
So that's why you slit her throat, because she wouldn't stop going off at the mouth?
Yeah, I'm screaming and yelling.
What'd you do after that?
Fired up another cigar, and I just couldn't believe what had happened.
And what happened?
I threw my telephone in the toilet.
Mm-hmm. Why?
I just ain't want to be bothered anymore.
What'd you do with the clothes you were wearing at the time?
The undershorts I kept on, and I had threw some jeans on.
In the majority of cases, if someone's delusional, they continue to act in a way consistent with their delusion. But in his case, we do see behaviors that he's not a delusional mental health case, but instead someone who's thinking clearly, rationally about what he's doing and hiding evidence.
He's aware of the tactical importance, not that he has a mental illness or not, but of the perception that he has a mental illness, that he is symptomatic, and that if he did kill her, that he did it due to a mental illness and it's not his fault.
You guys were arguing, having problems, or what?
It was pretty much arguing and commotion.
What did she fuss at you about?
Trying to treat her the right way and all this kind of stuff. Say positive things.
What type of things do you normally say to her that aren't nice?
Well, it all depends on how much she pissed me off.
What type of things does she say that make you angry?
She'll say things like, I might have to call Lakeside Behavior Center, or she gonna call my mom for me.
Lakeside Behavioral Center, I guess it's some psychiatric center where he received treatment. One, he's introducing more material to say, hey, I want you to think I have a mental illness that's making me not responsible for this. Two, I want you to think that my dead girlfriend also thought I had a mental illness.
So she's not mean, you think she's just trying to get you help, or no? Or does she say it mean-spirited?
No, she doesn't like to hear my opinion.
Okay.
When majority of the time I'm right.
What do you think your daughter would have thought if she would have seen what was happening?
I wouldn't even do that in front of her.
You would have made sure that she didn't see that happen to her mom?
Mm-hmm.
Because that would have been pretty bad for her, huh?
Yes.
I don't believe him when he says, oh, I wouldn't do that with my daughter there. And I say that because I haven't seen any expressions of remorse or consideration for other people's feelings. We don't hear any concern about her future. What will she think of it? How will she react? Who will she live with? This is a lack of remorse that's really commonly seen in psychopathy.
When was the last time you and Remy had sex?
Right after the stabbing.
Did she have a problem with you having sex with her after you stabbed her?
I don't know. She didn't say much as she did.
So this is after she's been stabbed, her throat slit, she's been punched in the face?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So she was probably not even conscious?
Most likely.
Okay. Do you think she was deceased?
Maybe.
Maybe she was dead when you were having sex?
I just wanted to get the rest of it out of me.
Okay.
The rest of these whatever crap they put on me, I just wanted to release all of it.
There's a wide range of reasons why people have sex with dead people. He says it's getting the voodoo magic out of him, but in the big picture, it sounds more like psychopathy to me. There's not a sexual satisfaction, there is a power satisfaction from it.
Psychopaths sometimes do engage in sexually deviant behavior. Having sex with a dead body is the ultimate control for him.
Ever been diagnosed with mental illness?
I was taking meds at one point, but not like I was supposed to.
Yeah. So you were able to combat these voices by taking meds?
Well,
I wasn't getting the voices like how I was getting them
last night.
He's letting her think there's a relationship between the medications and voices. The medications he says he takes are not medications that are used for schizophrenia, the core symptoms of someone hearing voices being delusional. So this is him creating a story in the mind of the interrogators to manipulate their view of him. Again, something that we see in psychopathy.
We was talking about voodoo and all this kind of magic power crap, and next thing you know, I got it in my head. Everywhere I look, it's like a voice that I remember. I'm like, yo, that's you right there. Yo, that's you right. I'm like, dang, man, I'm going like weird. It's weird.
I never felt like that.
Do you see things too, or just hear?
Nah, just seeing. I mean, just hearing.
When he said, just seeing, no, I mean just hearing, I thought that slip up was actually significant. He's not speaking from experience, from the experience of having hallucinations. So I think he's thinking on the fly, trying to figure out what to say, and he's not doing a great job. He looks more like a manipulating psychopath. He's trying to manage the interrogation so they think he's crazy, but I don't believe that he is.
He's so callous, and he talks about this as if he's on stage at a comedy show, you know, and talking about how weird this experience is for him. But in fact, he's talking about the murder of his girlfriend.
Mom, listen.
All right.
Do you remember when I had got expelled from high school?
Okay, first of all, let me tell you something. You the one that went up against that boy.
No, I didn't. He pulled the knife out.
No. I'm talking before that. That's why he brought the knife to you.
Man, please.
You was bullying him.
Whatever. If I would have stayed there, I would be, you already know. I had a talent level that was out of control.
Yeah, but your talent compared to your attitude are two different things. You always had that temper. Then you want to run your mouth.
I'm glad I'm hearing it from you, because that's where I got it from.
He's created this fantasy.
It starts with a sound that never made it into any police report, the low mechanical hum of a streetlight flickering on at dusk, casting an unsteady orange glow over a quiet California cul-de-sac where nothing ever happened until the night it did. Until the night a single scream was swallowed by distance and the world kept moving, unaware that a cold case was being born in real time, one that would sit in evidence lockers and memory gaps for decades, one that would harden into legend, rumor, and fear. In the summer of 1998, California was loud and fast and distracted, obsessed with celebrity trials and .com fortunes, while in a modest neighborhood tucked between dry hills and commuter roads, 24-year-old Emily Carter finished a late shift and never made it home. Her car was found the next morning, parked crookedly near her apartment complex, driver's door ajar, keys still in the ignition, radio frozen on a pop song that would climb the charts for weeks after she vanished. No sign of a struggle. No blood. No note. Just absence, clean and terrifying. By noon, the story had leaked. Missing woman. No suspects. Community on edge. By nightfall, the word cold case was already being whispered, not officially, not yet, but quietly, the way people speak when they sense the ending before the story has finished telling itself. Police canvassed the area with flashlights and clipboards, knocking on doors, asking the same questions, hearing the same answers. No, didn't see anything. No, didn't hear anything. No, nothing unusual. A dog barked, someone argued, a car drove by too fast. Nothing that felt important until hindsight sharpened it into something cruel. Emily was ordinary in the way victims often are, and communities later mythologize. She worked retail. She called her mother every Sunday. She had plans for the fall. Friends described her as careful, not reckless, not the type to get into a stranger's car. Her disappearance didn't fit a neat narrative, and that made it worse. There was no obvious enemy, no public feud, no warning signs to comfort the living with logic. She simply stepped out of the frame. The first break came fast and went nowhere. A neighbor reported a dark sedan idling near the complex that night. Another swore they saw a man standing too close, speaking too softly. Composite sketches were drawn, erased, redrawn. Tips flooded in, then slowed, then curdled into silence. Detectives followed leads that dissolved under scrutiny. Ex-boyfriends with alibis, co-workers with nothing to hide, drifters passing through town whose names were already fading by the time they were written down. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Search teams combed nearby hills, dry riverbeds, abandoned lots. Cadaver dogs alerted and then fell quiet. Helicopters traced patterns in the sky that meant nothing to the ground below. The community watched, waited, hoped, and then did the unthinkable thing people always do when hope becomes exhausting. They adjusted. Life resumed. Stores reopened. Conversations changed. Emily's name slipped from the headlines, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher shocks. Inside the police department, the case file thickened even as progress thinned. Evidence bags were sealed and shelved. A torn receipt, a single hair found on the passenger seat. Fibers too common to mean anything at the time. In 1998, DNA was powerful but imperfect, expensive and slow, a promise more than a guarantee. Samples were taken, logged, and quietly deprioritized as resources shifted to cases that could still be saved. Emily's family didn't adjust. They measured time differently now, by anniversaries and unanswered phone calls, by birthdays celebrated with empty chairs. Her mother kept the porch light on for years, an irrational ritual she refused to abandon. Her father learned the language of investigations, the careful non-answers, the sympathetic shrugs.
"We're still looking," they said.
We haven't forgotten. But forgetting doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just happens. By the early 2000s, the case had cooled enough to earn its label officially. Cold case. 2 words heavy with implication, meaning nothing active, nothing imminent, nothing promised. The file was transferred to a smaller unit, handled by fewer hands. Each new detective brought fresh eyes and the same inevitable frustration. They traced timelines again. Re-interviewed witnesses older now, less certain, memories blurred by time and suggestion. Small inconsistencies surfaced, then collapsed under scrutiny. Nothing held. Rumors filled the vacuum left by facts. Someone said Emily had planned to leave town. Someone else claimed she was involved in something dangerous. Online forums dissected her life with invasive certainty, strangers assigning motives and mistakes. The neighborhood developed its own mythology, warnings whispered to teenagers, glances exchanged at night. The unsolved became a presence, a cautionary tale etched into the local psyche. Years passed. Technology evolved. Databases grew. Old evidence sat patiently, waiting for a future it didn't yet know how to reach. Somewhere in a storage room, the hair from Emily's car remained sealed, untouched, unremarkable. A small thing, easy to overlook, easy to underestimate. Detectives retired. New ones arrived. The case was reopened and closed in cycles, each revival fueled by optimism and ended by the same familiar wall. No body. No crime scene. No suspect who could survive a courtroom. The absence itself became the crime, impossible to prosecute, impossible to resolve. And yet, absence leaves traces. It alters routines. It changes how people lock doors, how they look at strangers, how they remember the past. In that California town, 1998 never fully ended. It lingered in the spaces between streetlights, in the quiet moments before sleep, in the knowledge that something had slipped through their fingers and never come back. Toward the end of the decade, a new generation of investigators began combing through old cases with new tools, chasing patterns instead of individuals, data instead of hunches. Cold cases were no longer just tragedies. They were puzzles waiting for technology to catch up. Names were run through expanded databases. Evidence was retested. The past was invited, cautiously, back into the present. Emily Carter's file was pulled again. Not with fanfare. Not with expectations. Just another box on a table, another story that refused to end. They read the reports, studied the photos, noted the small details that had once seemed irrelevant. The hair, the fibers, the quiet night. The scream no one could quite remember hearing. Outside the department, the community barely noticed.
It had learned not to.
Cold cases had a way of disappointing hope. But inside that room, under fluorescent lights, something shifted. Not an answer, not yet, but a tension, a sense that the story might not be finished after all. Because cold cases don't stay cold forever. They wait. They harden. They learn patience. And sometimes, decades later, they exhale, releasing a truth so sharp it shocks everyone who thought the past was safely buried, reminding a community that time doesn't erase crimes, it only hides them quietly until the moment they decide to be found. The first rule of a cold case is this: nothing moves until something small moves first, and in the early 2010s that something was not a confession or a witness coming forward but a quiet procedural change buried deep inside a state crime lab. A shift so technical it barely registered outside fluorescent-lit rooms where technicians spoke in acronyms and chain-of-custody logs, a change that allowed old evidence to be tested again, not faster but deeper, not broader but more precise. And when Emily Carter's name resurfaced on a digital cue, it wasn't because someone remembered her face, but because an algorithm flagged a sample long assumed to be exhausted. The hair from the passenger seat was still there, sealed in plastic yellowed by time, catalogued under a number that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't memorized the file. Back in 1998, it had been tested once, yielding partial results, too incomplete to compare, too contaminated to trust, and so it had been quietly set aside, a footnote in a case already drowning in them. Now it was back under a microscope, fragmented DNA teased apart with methods that didn't exist when Emily vanished, every molecule treated like a witness that had waited patiently to speak. No one announced it. No press release. No call to the family. Cold case units learned early not to wake ghosts unless they were sure they could hold them. The lab ran the sample twice, then a third time, eliminating contamination, confirming consistency, building a profile slowly, cautiously, the way you approach something you've been burned by before. When the numbers stabilized, when the peaks aligned, the technician leaned back in their chair and stared at the screen a little longer than necessary. The profile was incomplete, but strong enough to run. Databases don't gasp. They don't react. They simply compare, millions of entries stacked against one another in silence, probabilities ticking upward or collapsing to zero. Emily's sample entered the system late one afternoon, and for a while nothing happened, the screen returning the familiar emptiness investigators had learned to expect. Then, hours later, a notification appeared, not a match but a near match, distant, partial, statistically insignificant on its own but impossible to ignore when paired with context. A familial hit. Someone related, not identical, not close enough to accuse, but close enough to suggest a bloodline that intersected with a crime scene 15 years earlier. The name attached to that hit belonged to a man arrested for an unrelated offense 2 states away, someone with no obvious connection to Emily, no shared address, no overlapping employment, no reason to be in that California neighborhood in 1998. On paper, it meant nothing. In reality, it meant everything had just changed. Detectives pulled the file again, this time with urgency. They mapped family trees, traced siblings, cousins, estranged relatives. They looked for anyone who might have traveled, anyone who might have drifted through California in the late 90s and left no trace behind. The work was slow, tedious, and fragile. One wrong assumption could collapse the entire line of inquiry, and cold cases had a way of punishing impatience. They found him on the third branch. A man who had lived in California in 1998, briefly, quietly, renting rooms, working temporary jobs, never staying long enough to be remembered. His name appeared once in a supplemental report from the original investigation, a neighbor's offhand comment about a guy who'd moved out weeks after Emily disappeared, a detail too thin to pursue at the time. Now it felt heavier, darker, weighted by years of absence. He was older now, grayer, settled, with a family and a life that looked stable from the outside. He had never been arrested, never been questioned, never been linked to anything violent. When detectives ran his name through internal systems, nothing lit up. No red flags. No history. Just a man who had passed unnoticed through a town that never forgot what he left behind. Surveillance began quietly. Public records were pulled. Old addresses revisited. Detectives knocked on doors not to accuse but to listen, asking neighbors what kind of man he was, what kind of habits he kept. The answers were infuriatingly normal. Polite, reserved, kept to himself. The kind of descriptions that never make headlines but haunt investigators who know how often monsters wear ordinary faces. They needed his DNA. In modern investigations, that moment carries a strange weight. The decision to step from observation into action, to risk spooking a suspect or contaminating a case. They couldn't compel a sample. Not yet. So they waited, followed, documented, searching for something discarded, something mundane. A coffee cup, a cigarette, a napkin that could bridge decades with a few cells of skin. It happened outside a grocery store on an unremarkable morning. He exited with a paper bag, paused, drank from a bottle of water, and dropped it into a public trash can without a second thought. An investigator waited until he was gone, retrieved the bottle with gloved hands, sealed it, logged it, and drove it straight to the lab without saying a word. The test took weeks. No one slept well. Cold case teams learn not to hope, but hope has a way of creeping in anyway, especially when the pieces finally start to resemble something whole. When the results came back, they didn't shout. They didn't celebrate. They stared at the numbers, the match probabilities climbing higher with each marker, the statistical margins collapsing into certainty. It was a match. The DNA from the bottle aligned with the hair from Emily's car, not loosely, not partially, but definitively, a connection so strong it erased decades of doubt in a single stroke. The room went quiet. Someone exhaled. Someone else swore under their breath. 15 years of absence suddenly had a shape, a name, a heartbeat. But DNA answers only one question. Who was there? It doesn't explain why. It doesn't tell you what happened after. It doesn't show you where a body might be hidden or whether a crime escalated beyond what evidence can prove. Investigators knew this was not the end. It was the most dangerous part, the moment when truth feels close enough to touch, but can still slip away. They brought him in for questioning under the pretense of routine follow-up, careful not to reveal what they knew. He sat calmly across the table, hands folded, expression open, answering questions with measured ease. Yes, he had lived in California. Yes, he remembered the neighborhood vaguely. No, he didn't recall Emily Carter. The name meant nothing to him, he said, his voice steady, unbroken. When confronted with the DNA, the room shifted. His posture changed first, subtle but unmistakable. The calm fractured. He asked questions now.
How?
From where? What evidence? Investigators watched his face, searching for cracks, for fear, for guilt. What they saw instead was calculation, a mind racing not to deny, but to understand the shape of the trap closing around him. He asked for a lawyer. Outside that room, word began to spread, carefully, quietly. A cold case might be warming. A family might get answers. A community might finally exhale. But seasoned detectives knew better than to declare victory. They had a suspect, yes. They had DNA, yes. But they still had no body. No confession. No timeline that could survive cross-examination. The past had finally spoken. The question now was whether it would finish the sentence, or retreat into silence once more, leaving everyone suspended between shock and certainty, between justice and the haunting possibility that even with a name attached, some cold cases never truly end. The arrest didn't come quickly, and that delay mattered, because in cold cases the space between discovery and action is where truth either solidifies or fractures beyond repair, and investigators knew they were standing on a narrow bridge suspended over decades of doubt. Every step needing to be precise, every move weighed against the risk of losing what they had just clawed back from time itself. They released him that day. No cuffs. No charges. Just a polite ending to an interview that had changed everything and nothing at once. He walked out into the sunlight and drove home, And for the first time since 1998, the man who had passed through Emily Carter's life unnoticed was no longer invisible. Surveillance intensified. Phones were monitored. Old associates were located. The investigation widened outward from him like a ripple, disturbing memories that had long settled into stillness. The problem was simple and brutal. DNA put him in her car, but it didn't explain how, when, or under what circumstances. Defense attorneys dismantle simplicity for a living. They would say consent. They would say coincidence. They would say contamination. And without a body, without a cause of death, without a crime scene soaked in certainty, those arguments could land. So detectives went backward. They rebuilt the last 48 hours of Emily's life with obsessive care, pulling credit card records, pager logs, time cards, receipts, fragments of a routine that had once seemed too ordinary to matter. They re-interviewed coworkers who had aged into different people, voices quieter now, memories softened by time. Someone remembered her being distracted that night. Someone else recalled a man waiting near the parking lot, not threatening, just there, leaning against a car, as if he belonged. They pulled traffic data from archives no one had touched in years, grainy footage stored on degrading tape, frames stitched together like a flipbook of the past. Most of it showed nothing. Headlights. Shadows. Motion without meaning. Then a partial plate surfaced, barely legible, caught at an angle no one had bothered to enhance before. It didn't match his current vehicle. That was expected. 15 years is a long time for metal to disappear. Old DMV records filled the gap. In 1998, he had driven a dark sedan registered under a temporary address, less than 3 miles from Emily's apartment. The plate didn't fully match, but it was close enough to make coincidence start to suffocate under its own weight. Detectives felt the case tightening, but tightening doesn't mean closed. It means pressure, and pressure makes people react. They watched him closely after that. He changed his routines. Stopped going to the same grocery store. Took different routes to work. These weren't crimes. They were instincts. Innocent people feel watched too, but seasoned investigators know the difference between discomfort and calculation. He wasn't panicking. He was adapting. They turn to the one thing cold cases are built on when evidence runs thin: people. A former roommate came forward after a quiet knock on a door he hadn't opened to law enforcement in decades. He remembered the man differently than neighbors did. Restless. Moody. Gone for hours at night with no explanation. Once, after Emily disappeared, he'd come home late with scratches on his forearms and a story that didn't quite settle. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it meant everything, and still not enough. Another witness remembered a fight. Not loud. Not violent. Just tension, voices tight, the kind of argument you overhear and forget because it feels private. It had happened near Emily's building days before she vanished. The man's description was vague, unreliable, filtered through years of retelling, but the shape of it aligned just enough to keep detectives from letting go. They searched old dump sites, areas once accessible but now swallowed by development. Construction crews paused as investigators combed soil with ground-penetrating radar, the past intersecting with the present in unsettling ways. Each anomaly raised hope. Each excavation ended in disappointment. No remains. No closure. Just more silence. The family waited. They had been here before, close enough to feel answers breathing down their necks, only to watch them dissolve. This time felt different. They were careful not to say it aloud, not to name the thing they were afraid of losing. Emily's mother listened to updates with a steadiness carved from years of grief. Her father asked practical questions. Where does this lead? What happens next? When will we know? No one could promise anything. Prosecutors entered the conversation reluctantly, their language precise, cautious. DNA alone, they said, is powerful but dangerous. Without context, it can illuminate and mislead at the same time. They needed more. A timeline that placed him with her that night. Evidence that suggested force. Something that could turn presence into culpability. Then something shifted. A financial record surfaced that had been misfiled years earlier, a cash withdrawal made from an ATM near Emily's apartment less than an hour after her shift ended, a time when she should have been driving home. The card wasn't hers. It belonged to him. At the time, the transaction had seemed mundane, invisible among thousands of others. Now it sat like a pin pressed into a map. He had no reason to be there, not officially. When confronted later, he would say coincidence again, routine again, normal again. But coincidences don't stack neatly. They pile up, leaning, until they start to look like intent. The pressure mounted. Investigators scheduled a second interview, this time with more weight behind it, this time letting him feel the gravity of what they were building. They laid out pieces, without revealing the whole picture. The car, the DNA, the ATM, the witnesses. They watched his reactions carefully, noting when he interrupted, when he deflected, when his answers grew sharper, less patient. At one point he smiled. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it landed wrong, a flicker of something unreadable that left the room colder than before. Detectives have learned to trust moments like that, not because they prove guilt, but because they reveal comfort with the game, an understanding of stakes that most innocent people don't possess. Still, he said nothing. He denied everything. He leaned on the absence of a body, the absence of proof beyond numbers and memory. And legally, he wasn't wrong. As months passed, the investigation became a balancing act between momentum and decay. Witnesses grew tired. Evidence risked being challenged. The story threatened to sprawl beyond the clean lines prosecutors crave. Cold cases don't just demand answers, they demand endurance. Outside, the community began to feel it again, the old unease rising, news reports using words like breakthrough and stunning DNA match, headlines resurrecting a name that had never truly left. People talked, speculated, argued. The town reopened a wound it had spent years pretending was scar tissue. Inside the task force, one truth hovered unspoken. They were closer than ever, and still terrifyingly far. Because solving a cold case isn't about finding the right person. It's about proving the right story. And as the past pressed harder against the present, everyone involved could feel it. The sense that whatever really happened in 1998 was finally straining to surface, and when it did, it would not come gently. The break didn't come as a revelation but as erosion, the slow wearing down of a story that had been held too tightly for too long, and investigators recognized it immediately because cold cases don't explode open, they leak. Truth seeping through hairline fractures until denial can no longer hold its shape. It started with a storage unit. A line item buried in old financial records, overlooked because it wasn't dramatic, because it didn't scream motive or violence, just a monthly charge that appeared in 1998 and vanished months later. The unit had been rented under his name at a facility 20 miles from Emily's apartment, a distance chosen not for convenience but for separation, far enough to feel safe, close enough to control. At the time, no one thought to look. Now it felt deliberate. The unit itself was empty when investigators arrived, stripped clean years ago, concrete bare, air stale, nothing to photograph except dimensions and dust. But emptiness doesn't mean innocence. It means time. And time leaves traces in places people forget to clean. They pulled old facility logs, paper records curling at the edges, signatures faded but legible. He had accessed the unit twice in the week after Emily disappeared, once late at night, once early in the morning. No cameras then. No witnesses who remembered. Just ink on paper, stubborn and patient. Forensics swept the space anyway, not expecting miracles, just refusing to surrender possibility. They found fibers embedded deep in a crack along the wall, trapped beneath layers of grime. Blue synthetic. Common. Too common to matter in 1998. But Emily had worn a blue jacket the night she vanished. It had never been found. The fibers couldn't prove transfer. Couldn't prove location. Couldn't prove time. But they whispered consistency, a soft chorus of alignment that investigators were learning to listen to. The case tightened again. Prosecutors remained cautious, pressing for restraint, aware that every added detail increased both strength and vulnerability. Defense would argue confirmation bias, retrofitting coincidence into narrative. Cold cases walk that knife edge constantly, and falling off either side is fatal. Then the roommate called back. Not the same one. Another. A man who had shared an apartment with a suspect briefly after he moved away from California, someone investigators had dismissed early because his timeline didn't overlap the crime directly. Time changes people. Distance loosens tongues. He sounded nervous on the phone, voice catching, asking if he was in trouble for not saying something sooner. He wasn't. He said the man had talked in his sleep. Not clearly. Not confessionally. Just fragments. Names. Places. Apologies whispered into darkness. At the time, it felt meaningless, the strange intimacy of sharing walls with someone carrying something heavy. One night, he'd woken to hear him say, "I didn't mean to hurt her," over and over, like a mantra, like a wound pressed too often. Sleep talk is unreliable. Courts hate it. Investigators treat it carefully, like broken glass. But they logged it anyway because cold cases aren't built on single pillars. They're built on accumulation. They brought the suspect in again. This time, the tone changed. No casual conversation. No soft probing. They confronted him with the storage unit, the fibers, the access logs, the ATM, the DNA, laying the pieces out not as accusations but as facts that refused to stay isolated. They watched him retreat inward, shoulders tightening, jaw setting, the confidence from earlier interviews evaporating under the weight of pattern. He denied it all again. But denial has texture. It evolves. Early denial is broad, dismissive. Late denial becomes specific, defensive, tangled in detail. He corrected investigators unnecessarily. He offered explanations no one had asked for. He insisted on dates, times, routes, as if rehearsing a map only he could see. When they asked about Emily's jacket, he froze. Just for a second. Just long enough. "I don't know what she was wearing," he said, too quickly, and the room changed temperature. Investigators exchanged a glance. They hadn't told him about the jacket. It wasn't public. It had never been mentioned in any interview or report he had access to. Knowledge leaks matter more than emotion. They ended the interview shortly after. Outside, the world kept turning. Inside the task force, a quiet certainty began to crystallize. They were no longer asking if he was involved. They were asking how much they could prove, how much they could risk, how far the truth would carry them before collapsing under scrutiny. Emily's family was informed of the progress in careful increments, each update measured to avoid hope turning into devastation. They listened. They nodded. They had learned the cost of believing too early. Still, something had shifted in their voices. The weight was still there, but now it leaned forward instead of down. Media attention intensified. Old photos resurfaced. Headlines recycled words like cold case and stunning DNA, commentators speculating late into the night, constructing narratives with a confidence only distance provides. The community reacted the way communities always do. Some relieved that answers might be coming, others resistant, protective of the idea that nothing truly evil could have lived among them unnoticed. The suspect's family closed ranks. They hired counsel. They declined interviews. They insisted on his character, his stability, his lack of history. And they were right about one thing. Monsters don't always look monstrous. They often look like men who age quietly, raise families, and learn how to bury the parts of themselves that don't fit daylight. Investigators prepared for arrest. But preparation is not action. Not yet. They needed one more piece, something that could anchor everything else, something that could survive the inevitable storm of cross-examination. They returned to the one absence that haunted the case from the beginning, the body. They revisited every location tied to him in 1998, not just the obvious ones but the forgotten spaces, the in-between places people pass without noticing. Old work sites, rural turnoffs, patches of land that had changed hands and names. They chased rumors, followed instincts, dug where maps intersected with behavior. Nothing. Each failed search drained momentum, But it also clarified something investigators were beginning to accept. The case might move forward without physical remains. It wouldn't be clean. It wouldn't be easy. But justice doesn't always wait for bones. When the arrest finally came, it wasn't dramatic. No sirens screaming through quiet streets. No cameras waiting. Just a knock on a door and a set of words spoken carefully, deliberately, because this moment carried decades of weight. He was taken into custody without resistance, face unreadable, eyes forward. The charge was narrow.
Kidnapping.
Not murder. Not yet. As he was led away, the past and present collided in a way no one in that California town had ever truly prepared for. A cold case was no longer cold. It was alive, breathing, demanding resolution. And as the doors closed behind him, one truth settled heavily over everyone involved. Solving a mystery doesn't end its impact. Sometimes, it's only the beginning of a deeper reckoning. The courtroom didn't feel like justice yet. It felt like rehearsal, a controlled space where language replaced certainty, and every word was chosen not to reveal truth, but to test how much of it could survive being spoken aloud. And as the kidnapping charge was read, people leaned forward expecting closure and found instead a new kind of tension, sharper, more dangerous, because now the past wasn't just remembered, it was contested. The defense moved quickly. They framed the arrest as overreach, a man targeted because technology had finally caught up to coincidence, because grief demanded a villain and cold cases make tempting shortcuts. They spoke calmly, confidently, dismantling emotion with logic, reminding the court that no body meant no proof of death, that DNA meant presence, not violence, that memory was fragile and witnesses unreliable. It was an argument designed not to win the case outright, but to slow it down, to bleed momentum until doubt became the loudest voice in the room. Prosecutors countered with pattern. They laid out the timeline with precision, each event a bead on a string pulled tight across 15 years. The ATM withdrawal, the storage unit, the fibers, the DNA, the inconsistencies, the knowledge he shouldn't have had. They avoided speculation, avoided motive, avoided the word murder entirely. They let absence speak for itself, let the silence left by Emily's disappearance echo through the gaps. Outside the courtroom, cameras captured fragments, grim faces, clasped hands, the flicker of hope no one dared name. Emily's parents sat together, older now, closer than ever, their expressions carved from endurance. They had waited too long to believe in miracles. They were here for something else. Recognition. Accountability. A public acknowledgement that Emily had not simply faded away. The judge allowed the case to proceed. It was a procedural victory, not an emotional one, but in cold cases procedure is oxygen. Without it, everything suffocates. A trial date was set. Motions were filed. Evidence lists grew. Each filing pulled the past further into the light, and with that exposure came risk. Defense investigators went to work, retracing the prosecution's steps with the sole purpose of undoing them. They questioned chain of custody records, probed lab protocols, searched for any hint of contamination or bias. They revisited witnesses with sharper questions, planting doubt where certainty had grown fragile with time. Cold cases are especially vulnerable to this kind of erosion. Every year that passes gives the defense another angle, another crack to pry open. One witness broke. The former roommate, shaken by the pressure, recanted part of his statement, unsure now whether the words he'd heard in the night were real or imagined, whether memory had rewritten itself under suggestion. The defense seized on it immediately. Media headlines shifted tone. From stunning DNA match to key witness falters. The narrative began to wobble. Inside the task force, frustration mounted. They had expected resistance. They had not expected how quickly the story could tilt. Cold cases live or die on perception as much as proof, and perception was slipping. Investigators revisited their strategy, re-examined their files, searching for something sturdier, something immune to reinterpretation. They returned to the digital. In 1998, Phones were dumb and data was sparse, but not non-existent. Old cell tower logs, once dismissed as useless, were pulled from archives and reprocessed with modern tools. The data was crude, approximate, but patterns emerged where none had been seen before. His phone had pinged near Emily's apartment that night. Not definitive, not exact, but aligned. The defense called it junk science. Prosecutors called it corroboration. The fight over language intensified, each side battling not over what happened, but over what words were allowed to describe it. Presence versus proximity. Coincidence versus convergence. Memory versus fact. The jury pool, watching from a distance, absorbed the conflict long before they were selected. Then, quietly, another lead surfaced. A woman contacted police after seeing coverage of the trial, her voice hesitant, apologetic, as if she were intruding on something sacred. She said she had gone on a date with a suspect in the late 90s, around the time Emily disappeared. He had told her he was moving soon, leaving California suddenly, urgently. On their last night together, he'd been distant, distracted. At one point, he'd asked her a strange question: how long it took for missing persons cases to go cold. She hadn't thought about it again until now. Her testimony wasn't explosive. It didn't introduce new evidence. But it added texture, motive-adjacent shading to a portrait that had been flat. It suggested awareness. It suggested foresight. It suggested a man thinking ahead while others were still reacting. The defense attacked her credibility. Why now? Why wait so long? Why trust memory over time? The questions were fair. The doubt landed. But even under cross-examination, she held steady, not insisting on certainty, just offering recollection, imperfect and human. The trial date approached. Behind closed doors, prosecutors debated escalation. Without a body, a murder charge would be a gamble, one that could end everything if it failed. But staying with kidnapping felt incomplete, a half-truth that satisfied law without satisfying reality. Emily had been gone too long. The absence was too total. Everyone in that room understood what they were really talking about, even if they never said it out loud. The defense sensed the hesitation. They pushed harder, filing motions to suppress evidence, to exclude testimony, to narrow the narrative until only sterile facts remained. They aimed to turn the case into a technical exercise, stripping it of the emotional gravity that had carried it this far. And still, something refused to disappear. Public pressure grew. Community vigils returned. Emily's face appeared on candles and posters, not as a missing woman now, but as a symbol of something unfinished. People wanted resolution not because it would erase the past, but because it would finally name it. In the final pretrial hearing before jury selection, the judge addressed the room with measured gravity. He spoke of time, of memory, of the responsibility carried by everyone present. He reminded them that the court was not a place for ghosts, only for evidence, but that evidence sometimes takes strange shapes when it has been waiting this long to be seen. As the gavel fell, one truth pressed itself into the silence. The case had passed the point of retreat. Whatever happened next would ripple backward and forward at once, reshaping the memory of 1998 and the lives that had been built on top of it. A cold case had entered its most dangerous phase, where answers were close enough to feel inevitable and just far enough away to still be lost forever. Jury selection turned the case from theory into flesh. 12 strangers pulled from ordinary lives and seated beneath the weight of a story older than some of them, a story that demanded they look backward without nostalgia and forward without fear. And as their names were called and their faces scanned, everyone in the room understood that whatever happened next would no longer belong to investigators or attorneys, but to people who had not lived through 1998 and yet were now being asked to judge it. Opening statements landed like controlled detonations. The prosecution spoke first, not loudly, not emotionally, but with the confidence of someone laying out a map they believed already existed in the jurors' minds. A young woman disappears. A car left open. DNA in a place it should not have been. A man who passed through her life and left nothing behind but traces. They did not promise answers. They promised coherence. They asked the jury to see the pattern, not the pieces. The defense followed with calm dismantling. They framed the case as a monument to assumption, a reminder that time corrodes truth as easily as it preserves it. They spoke of coincidence inflated by grief, of science misapplied, of memory reshaped by suggestion. They reminded the jury that certainty is seductive and that the justice system exists precisely to resist it. The witnesses came one by one. Technicians explained DNA in careful language, probabilities translated into metaphors, numbers softened for human ears. The match was strong, statistically overwhelming. But even they acknowledged limitations, margins, the difference between scientific confidence and legal proof. The defense pounced on every caveat, every admission that science does not speak in absolutes. Investigators took the stand next. They described the original search, the years of silence, the moment the case reopened. They spoke of procedure, of patience, of the discipline required to chase something that might never be caught. Under cross-examination, they were pressed on bias, on tunnel vision, on whether they had begun to see everything through the lens of a single suspect once the DNA pointed his way. They held their ground, but cracks showed. Not lies. Fatigue. Then came the civilians. The former roommates. The neighbors. The woman from the date. Each carried a piece of the past that had survived only because it had never been examined this closely before. Memory wavered under pressure. Timelines blurred. The defense did not need to prove them wrong. They only needed to make them uncertain. The courtroom atmosphere thickened. Jurors leaned back, then forward, absorbing contradictions, watching faces, weighing tone as much as content. Emily's parents sat still, hands folded, learning the hardest lesson cold cases teach, that truth can be debated without being diminished, that justice is not loud and rarely kind. Midway through the trial, the defense introduced its most dangerous idea. What if Emily left voluntarily? What if the absence wasn't violence but choice, the ultimate escape misinterpreted as tragedy? They offered no proof, just possibility, pointing to the lack of remains, the lack of a crime scene, the lack of definitive cause. They suggested a woman overwhelmed, stepping away, a life reinvented elsewhere. It was a story thin as paper, but it didn't need to be believed. It only needed to exist. The prosecution countered with reality. They spoke of routines, of family ties, of the human cost of disappearing. They reminded the jury that voluntary absence leaves patterns too, bank activity, contact, some echo of life continuing. Emily had left nothing. Not a trace. Not a whisper. Disappearance is not silence, they argued. It is disruption. Then the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived quietly. A forensic analyst took the stand to discuss something that had not been highlighted before, something buried in supplementary notes from the original investigation. Soil residue. Microscopic. Found in the trunk lining of Emily's car. At the time, it had been inconclusive, unremarkable. Now reanalyzed, it matched a composition found in a specific rural area outside the city, an area tied to the suspect through old employment records. The courtroom shifted. This was not a body, not even close, but it was movement, a suggestion of transport, a direction the absence might have taken. The defense objected immediately, questioning methodology, relevance, chain of custody. The judge allowed it with caution, instructing the jury carefully, deliberately. It was enough to change the air. For the first time, the story extended beyond the parking lot, beyond the car, beyond coincidence. It hinted at a trajectory, a path that led away from safety and into something unnamed. The defense regrouped. They attacked the science. They brought their own experts. They questioned the uniqueness of soil, the reliability of old samples, the temptation to overinterpret. The courtroom became a battleground of credentials and footnotes, certainty diluted by expertise on both sides. As days blurred into one another, exhaustion set in. Jurors rubbed temples. Attorneys spoke slower. Even the judge's voice softened with repetition. Cold cases demand stamina, and trials about them demand something harsher, attention without relief. There were no dramatic confessions. No surprise witnesses bursting through doors. Just the steady grind of narrative versus narrative. Closing arguments loomed. The prosecution asked the jury to consider the totality, not as a checklist, but as a story that refused to fracture. A man's DNA in a missing woman's car. His financial presence at the wrong place and time. His access to secluded areas. His knowledge of details he shouldn't have known. His disappearance from her orbit followed by her disappearance from the world. They did not say murder. They let the implication breathe. The defense asked for restraint. They reminded the jury that doubt is not weakness, that the absence of proof is not proof of absence, but also not proof of guilt. They urged them to protect the system by refusing to fill gaps with assumption, to honor Emily by demanding certainty rather than settling for a story that felt complete. The jury was sent to deliberate. The courtroom emptied slowly, people standing as if reluctant to break the spell, as if movement might shatter something fragile. Emily's parents were escorted to a quiet room, the weight beginning again, different now but no less heavy. Hours passed, then days. Notes came back with questions about DNA, about timelines, about definitions. The judge answered carefully, never guiding, only clarifying. Outside, the media speculated, analysts filling airtime with theories, predictions, the hunger for resolution palpable. Inside the jury room, the past argued with itself. Some jurors saw the pattern clearly, felt the weight of convergence pressing toward inevitability. Others clung to the gaps, the missing pieces that no amount of inference could replace. The debate was not angry. It was somber. This was not a whodunit. This was a reckoning. When the verdict finally came, the room filled again, breath held collectively, the sound of bodies settling into seats echoing louder than any gavel. The foreperson stood, paper trembling slightly, eyes scanning the words as if seeing them for the first time. And in that suspended moment, before language reasserted control, everyone understood the same thing at once. Whatever was about to be said would not end the story. It would only define how the story would be carried forward, by a family, by a community, by a system that had waited 15 years to speak, and was now discovering how hard it is to say the right thing when silence has had so long to settle. The verdict did not arrive like thunder, it arrived like weight, settling into the room one word at a time, and as the foreperson spoke, voices low and careful, the language of the law cut through years of speculation with a precision that felt almost cruel in its restraint. Guilty on the charge of kidnapping. Not guilty on anything else, because there was nothing else before the court to judge. The reaction was not explosive. No gasps. No shouts. Just a long exhale rippling through the benches as people tried to understand what justice looked like when it came in halves. Emily's mother closed her eyes. Her father nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a truth he had already carried for years. It was not the ending they had imagined, but it was an ending that spoke, and after decades of silence, speech mattered. The defendant showed no visible reaction. He stood as the verdict was read, face composed, hands still, absorbing the outcome with a calm that unsettled observers more than any outburst could have. When the judge asked if he wished to say anything before sentencing, he declined, his voice flat, practiced, a man who had learned how to survive by giving nothing away. Sentencing was scheduled weeks later. Time stretched again, familiar and cruel, but this time it stretched toward something defined. Prosecutors prepared impact statements. Defense attorneys prepared mitigation. Emily's family prepared themselves, unsure what preparation even meant anymore. A conviction brings relief, but it also sharpens grief, transforming absence into something officially acknowledged but still unresolved. In the weeks between verdict and sentencing, the investigation did not stop. A guilty verdict on kidnapping reopened doors that had been legally sealed. Warrants expanded. Searches resumed. Investigators returned to the rural area hinted at by the soil evidence, now armed with probable cause and renewed urgency. Landowners were contacted. Old wells were inspected. Ground was disturbed again, this time with a grim patience born of experience. Nothing surfaced. The earth remained stubbornly silent, and with each empty dig, the same question resurfaced, heavier now. Had time erased what people needed to find, or had it been hidden too well from the start? At sentencing, the courtroom filled again. This time the air was different. Less tense. More solemn. The judge spoke at length, acknowledging the limitations of the case, the courage of witnesses, the weight borne by the family. He spoke of kidnapping as a crime that does not end when the act does, that stretches forward indefinitely, trapping families in an unending present. The sentence was severe, but bounded. Decades in prison. Enough to ensure he would grow old behind walls, enough to signal accountability without pretending to answer questions the court could not legally touch. As the number was read aloud, Emily's mother reached for her husband's hand. He squeezed back. It was not closure. It was something adjacent to it, something imperfect but real. The defendant was led away. Cameras caught a final glimpse of him disappearing through a side door, a man now officially bound to a name and a crime that had once floated without anchor. The headlines that followed were decisive, confident, hungry. Cold case solved. Justice after 15 years. The language was comforting. It was also wrong, because solving a cold case on paper does not solve it in life. Emily was still gone. No remains. No confession. No final account of what happened after she stepped into that car and vanished into a night that refused to give her back. The conviction answered who. It did not answer how, or why, or where. In prison, he adjusted quickly. Inmates described him as quiet, observant, a man who kept his distance and his routine. He filed appeals almost immediately, challenging evidence, procedure, interpretation. Each filing reopened wounds, dragged Emily's name back into public records, forcing her family to relive the case in cycles dictated by paperwork and deadlines. Some appeals failed quickly. Others lingered. Years passed again, differently now. Time no longer felt frozen. It felt suspended, waiting to see if the story would twist once more. Cold cases have a way of refusing finality, and this one was no exception. Then, unexpectedly, a letter arrived. It was addressed not to the court, but to the district attorney's office, postmarked from the prison. No confession. No apology. Just a request. He wanted to talk. Not about kidnapping. About something else. Investigators debated for days. They had learned not to trust sudden openness, especially after conviction. Some saw manipulation, an attempt to gain leverage, attention, control. Others saw opportunity, however slim. Cold cases train people to chase even the faintest signal because sometimes that's all that's left. They agreed to meet. The interview room was smaller this time, more secure, stripped of any pretense. He sat across from them in prison-issued clothing, older now, the edges softened by routine confinement. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not ask for anything. He talked slowly. About 1998. About being young. About feeling invisible. About choices that felt small in the moment and enormous in hindsight. He spoke around the edges of the night Emily disappeared, circling it without entering, describing emotions without actions, fear without cause. Then he said something that made the room go quiet. I know where it ended, he said. Not where she was. Not what he did. Just where it ended. Investigators leaned forward, pens hovering, hearts cautious. They had heard versions of this before, half-truths offered like bait. They asked him to clarify. He smiled faintly, not cruelly, just tiredly, and said he would need assurances. Not immunity. Not release. Just to be heard. Negotiations began again. Lawyers returned. Conditions were discussed. The past stretched forward once more, refusing to stay contained. Emily's family was informed carefully, bracing themselves for the possibility of answers and the certainty of pain. Because the most dangerous moment in any cold case is not when it is unsolved. It is when someone claims they are finally ready to speak. And as the system prepared to listen again, one truth loomed larger than all the rest. Even now, after verdicts and sentences and years of waiting, the story of 1998 was not finished with them yet. They did not trust the timing, and they did not trust the tone because experience had taught them that truth offered late is often shaped by need rather than remorse, but they listen anyway. Because cold cases survive on a single principle that overrides skepticism every time. The dead don't get second chances, and the missing don't get any at all. The conditions were narrow. No deal on sentence. No promises beyond being heard. His attorney sat nearby, silent, watchful. A recorder was placed on the table, its red light steady, indifferent. When he began to speak again, the room leaned in not with hope but with discipline, every word treated as evidence until proven otherwise. He talked about driving. Not that night, not directly, but about routes he used to take, back roads threading through scrubland and old industrial zones, places no one had reason to go unless they wanted not to be seen. He described the landscape with an accuracy that was unsettling. Turns, landmarks, the smell of oil and dust, details that had never appeared in reports, details no headline could have taught him. Investigators interrupted carefully, anchoring him to specifics, dates, times, names. Each time, he slid sideways, offering proximity without admission, geography without action. It was infuriating and familiar. Confession adjacent, truth-shaped, designed to hold power without fully surrendering it. Then he mentioned a creek. Seasonal, dry most of the year, flooding hard and fast when the rains came. He said it casually, as if remembering a place he used to fish as a kid, but the word hung there, heavy. There had been reports in 1998 of flash flooding in a rural area outside the city. Nothing catastrophic. Enough to change terrain. Enough to move things. Enough to erase. They asked him why he was telling them this now. He paused for a long time before answering, eyes unfocused, voice quieter than before. He said prison teaches you about time in a way freedom never does. He said nights stretch longer. He said some memories get louder when there's nothing left to drown them out. He did not say guilt. He did not say regret. He said tired. The search warrant came quickly. The area he described had changed. Subdivisions pressed up against open land. Roads widened. Drainage rerouted. What had once been remote was now adjacent to normal life, the past stitched uneasily into the present. Search teams moved carefully, aware that expectation can contaminate as easily as hope. They found nothing at first. Ground disturbed by decades of weather and construction gave up only debris, bone fragments that turned out to be animal, trash swallowed and spat back by the earth. Each false lead tightened the knot in everyone's chest. They had been here before, chasing shadows sharpened by desperation. Then a dog alerted. Not sharply, not insistently, just enough to make handlers stop, to mark the spot, to widen the grid. The area was near a bend in the creek, a place where water would slow and drop what it carried. Soil samples were taken. Excavation began again, methodical, restrained. The remains were incomplete. Fragments. Weathered. Time-worn. But human. Silence settled over the site in a way no one could mistake. Radios went quiet. Movement slowed. Someone called it in. Someone else looked away. After all these years, after all the waiting, the thing everyone had imagined and feared lay partially uncovered beneath the open sky. Forensic analysis took weeks. The bones told a limited story. Female. Age range consistent. Trauma inconclusive. Time and water had done their work too well. But dental records matched. A final confirmation delivered in clinical language that did nothing to soften its impact. Emily Carter had been found. The news broke carefully at first, released to the family before anyone else. Investigators sat with them as they absorbed it, watched grief transform again, this time into something sharper, more final.
Tears came.
Silence came. Relief did not. Closure is a word people use when they don't know what else to offer. The suspect was brought back in. Shown nothing. Told only that remains had been recovered. He closed his eyes briefly, exhaled, and nodded as if confirming something he had already accepted. He did not confess. He did not deny. He asked if she would be returned to her family. That was all. Prosecutors moved swiftly. Charges were amended. Murder was added. The legal threshold finally crossed now that absence had become evidence. Defense attorneys protested, citing timing, intent, procedural fairness. The judge allowed it. The past had shifted shape again, and the law was forced to follow. Public reaction surged. Vigils turned into memorials. Headlines shifted tone, trading speculation for certainty, shock for somber acknowledgement. The community that had lived with a ghost now faced a body, and the weight of that transition was heavier than anyone expected. In private, investigators reviewed the prison interview again and again. They noted what he had said, what he had not, the precision of place, the absence of action. He had led them there without walking the final steps himself. It was control without confession, truth without surrender. The second trial loomed. This time, the story would include bones, earth, and a final resting place pulled back into daylight. This time, the jury would not have to imagine what disappearance meant. They would see its aftermath. But even now, with remains recovered and charges escalated, something lingered unresolved, a thin wire of unease running beneath the narrative. Because the most disturbing thing about his cooperation was not that it came late. It was that it came measured. As if he had waited not for courage, not for forgiveness, but for the moment when speaking could no longer change his fate, only shape how the ending would be remembered. And as Emily was finally laid to rest, the town learned something it had never wanted to know, that some cold cases are not solved when answers are found, but when the truth stops asking for permission to exist, forcing its way into the present no matter how carefully it had been buried. The second trial did not feel like a continuation. It felt like a reckoning, the kind that arrives after denial has been stripped away and only consequence remains. And as the courtroom filled again, heavier now with the knowledge of what lay beneath the words, everyone understood that this was no longer about whether something terrible had happened, but about how directly the law could name it. This time, the prosecution did not have to ask the jury to imagine absence. They showed photographs of the recovery site, carefully framed, respectful, but undeniable. They introduced forensic diagrams, soil layers, water flow patterns, the slow mechanics of erosion that explained how a body could vanish and reappear decades later. They let experts speak not in hypotheticals, but in conclusions bounded by evidence. Emily was dead. She had not left voluntarily. She had not survived somewhere unseen. The mystery of where she went had ended. The question now was how she got there, and who put her on that path. The defense shifted strategy. They could no longer lean on disappearance as ambiguity, so they leaned into uncertainty of cause. No definitive trauma. No clear mechanism of death. They suggested accident.
Panic.
A tragic chain of events unmoored from intent. They acknowledged the kidnapping conviction but argued escalation without proof, urging the jury to separate wrongdoing from murder, presence from purpose. It was a narrower fight now, but no less fierce. Investigators testified again, this time with a different gravity. They described the prison interview in detail, the way he had guided them without confessing, the precision of geography paired with emotional distance. Under cross-examination, they were pressed on coercion, on whether the discovery of remains had been influenced by suggestion. They answered carefully. The record held. Then the prosecution played the recording. His voice filled the room, older, flatter, measured. Jurors listened to pauses as much as words, to what was avoided as much as what was offered. When he described the creek, heads lifted. When he spoke of flooding, pens stopped. The defense objected repeatedly. The judge overruled selectively, allowing the jury to hear enough to feel the weight without being led. Emily's parents did not watch the screen. They listened. At one point, Emily's mother reached into her bag and took out a small folded photograph, the kind carried not for display but for grounding. She held it quietly, as if anchoring herself to a version of her daughter untouched by evidence and exhibits. Expert witnesses followed. Forensic anthropologists explained what water does to bone, how time erases stories even as it preserves facts. Pathologists spoke carefully about what could not be determined, refusing to speculate where science could not support it. Their restraint made their conclusions heavier, not lighter.
This was not theater.
This was accounting. The defense called their own experts. They spoke of alternate interpretations, of statistical margins, of the danger of narrative momentum. They reminded the jury that certainty is not synonymous with truth, and that the law demands proof beyond emotion, beyond inference. It was a disciplined argument, and it landed with some. But then came the cross. Prosecutors asked simple questions. If not him, then who? If not intent, then what sequence of choices placed her body miles away from her car, in a location he alone had described with accuracy? If accident, why silence? If panic, why decades of denial? The defense objected. The question stayed. The defendant did not testify. He sat through the proceedings with the same composure he had shown since arrest, eyes forward, expression neutral, absorbing the case as if it belonged to someone else. Some jurors watched him closely. Others avoided looking at him at all. Closing arguments came without flourish. The prosecution spoke plainly. They acknowledged gaps. They named uncertainty where it existed. And then they asked the jury to consider behavior, not emotion. A man takes a woman against her will. She disappears. He lies. He relocates. He waits. Years later, he leads police to her remains without saying how he knows. They asked if that sequence could reasonably end anywhere other than guilt. The defense asked for discipline. They urged the jury not to punish a man twice for the same crime, not to fill silence with assumption, not to confuse moral outrage with legal proof. They acknowledged tragedy. They denied murder. They left the jury with doubt and asked them to protect it. Deliberations began again. This time, they were shorter. Not because the decision was easy, but because the shape of the story had changed. Bones have a way of collapsing argument. Place has a way of anchoring theory. The jury asked fewer questions. They returned sooner. When they filed back in, the room felt smaller. The foreperson stood, steadier now, paper held firmly. The verdict was read aloud, each word landing with finality that felt both inevitable and surreal.
Guilty.
On the charge of murder. Emily's father lowered his head. Emily's mother exhaled, a sound caught somewhere between relief and grief, the kind that carries no celebration. The defendant remained still, absorbing the words without visible response, a man whose fate had finally caught up to his past. Sentencing would follow. Appeals would come. The system would continue its careful, grinding work. But something fundamental shifted in that moment, something no filing could undo. The case that had lived for decades as rumor, fear, and unresolved absence had been named fully at last. Not solved cleanly, not healed, but acknowledged in the only language the system had. Outside, reporters spoke of justice completed, of closure achieved, of a cold case finally put to rest. Inside, those closest to Emily knew better. The truth had surfaced. That did not mean the pain had ended. As the courtroom emptied and the lights dimmed, one thing became clear to everyone who had followed the case from the beginning. Some stories do not conclude when the verdict is read. They simply stop asking permission to exist, settling into history with all their weight intact, leaving behind a silence that is no longer empty, but filled with everything that can never be undone. Sentencing arrived without suspense, because by then the future had narrowed to a single corridor, long and irreversible, and as the judge spoke, the words did not shock so much as confirm what everyone had already begun to live with. The past had finally imposed its full cost on the present. Life without the possibility of parole. The phrase landed heavily, not as vengeance, not as triumph, but as containment, a legal acknowledgement that some actions fracture time so completely they cannot be rejoined. The judge spoke of choice and consequence, of the calculated nature of silence, of years stolen not just from a young woman but from a family forced to live inside uncertainty. He spoke carefully, knowing that language could not restore anything it named. The defendant stood, hands clasped, eyes forward. When given the opportunity to speak, he shook his head. No apology. No explanation. No last attempt to shape the narrative. Whatever power he had once exercised through withholding was gone now, rendered irrelevant by a sentence that would outlast him. He was led away for the final time, disappearing into a system designed not to remember him, only to keep him. Outside the courthouse, microphones waited. Emily's parents stepped forward together, faces lined with exhaustion rather than relief. They spoke briefly, thanking investigators, jurors, anyone who had refused to let the case disappear. They did not use the word closure. They did not claim peace. Emily's mother said only this: "Now the truth has a place to stand." Then they turned and walked away from the cameras, from the building, from a chapter that had consumed more of their lives than any single structure ever could. The appeals came, as expected. Procedural challenges, evidentiary disputes, claims of prejudice and overreach. Each filing reopened old documents, summoned old arguments, forced the system to prove again that it had moved carefully, deliberately, lawfully. Some appeals were denied swiftly. Others lingered, climbing through courts with glacial patience. None overturned the verdict. Years passed again. This time, they felt different. Time no longer hovered. It moved. The case slipped from headlines into archives, resurfacing only on anniversaries or in legal footnotes. True crime podcasts dissected it with clinical fascination, debating turning points, speculating about motive, parsing interviews frame by frame. The story took on a second life, retold by people who had not lived through its waiting. For the family, life resumed in fragments. Emily's room was finally cleared, not erased, just reorganized into memory rather than expectation. Her parents moved houses, a decision that felt both practical and symbolic. You can't live forever in a place built around absence. You can only carry it with you, adjusting the weight. The community changed too. The neighborhood where Emily vanished no longer felt cursed, but it was never quite neutral again. Streetlights were replaced. Parking lots resurfaced. Children grew up hearing the story as something that had happened before they were born, a warning folded into local history. Fear softened into vigilance. Shock into narrative. Inside the prison, the man at the center of it all faded. He became another number, another routine, another body moving through days measured by counts and meals. He spoke little. He wrote occasionally. His requests for interviews dried up as attention shifted elsewhere. Without an audience, there was nothing left to perform. Investigators revisited the case one last time, not out of necessity, but ritual. They reviewed what had gone right, what had nearly gone wrong, how close the truth had come to never surfacing at all. They spoke about evidence preservation, about patience, about the strange partnership between technology and time. The cold cases, they agreed, do not reward brilliance as much as endurance. One detail lingered. During the prison interview, there had been a pause, a moment when he almost said more, when the story felt poised on the edge of fuller revelation. It never came. Whatever remained untold would remain that way, sealed behind a sentence that removed incentive without removing memory. And maybe that was fitting. Not every truth arrives whole. Not every question earns an answer. Justice systems are built to name responsibility, not to soothe curiosity. They draw lines. They do not fill voids. On the 20th anniversary of Emily's disappearance, a small plaque was placed near the creek. No names, no dates, just a sentence etched into metal, simple and unadorned. She was here. She mattered. The water moved past it quietly, indifferent as ever, carrying nothing now but reflection and leaves. People came and went. Some knew the story intimately. Others learned it standing there, reading, feeling the strange pull of a place that had once held a secret too heavy to stay buried. The land did not change, but something about how it was seen did. Because cold cases do not truly end when courts finish with them. They end when memory stabilizes, When absence is replaced not by speculation but by understanding, when a community stops asking what happened and starts asking what it owes to the living because of it. And even then, the echo remains. Late at night, when streets empty and lights hum, when routine's slow enough for old fears to resurface, there are moments when people remember how long the truth waited, how easily it might have been missed, how a single scream swallowed by distance can still ripple outward decades later. The case was closed. The story, however, was not done being told. Sentencing arrived without suspense, because by then the future had narrowed to a single corridor, long and irreversible, and as the judge spoke, the words did not shock so much as confirm what everyone had already begun to live with. The past had finally imposed its full cost on the present. Life without the possibility of parole. The phrase settled into the courtroom like dust after collapse, not loud, not dramatic, just heavy. The judge spoke of deliberation, of years of silence that functioned as intent, of the way violence can continue long after the act itself ends. He spoke carefully, aware that every sentence would be replayed, archived, dissected. None of it could give Emily back. That was not the point anymore. The defendant stood motionless. When offered the chance to speak, he declined with a slight shake of the head. No final words. No denial. No remorse shaped for record. He had spent decades controlling the narrative by withholding, and now even that control had evaporated. Guards moved in. Chains clicked softly. He was led away, not to outrage or hatred, but to administrative finality. Outside, microphones waited like scavengers. Emily's parents stepped forward briefly. They thanked investigators. They thanked jurors. They did not thank the system. Emily's mother said only that her daughter could finally be laid to rest without an asterisk, without a question mark. Her father said the waiting was over, and that was enough. Then they turned away, ending a public vigil that had lasted longer than many lives. The appeals followed as they always do. Pages of arguments, claims of error, accusations of bias wrapped in legal language. Each motion forced the case back into light, reopening wounds that had barely begun to scar. Most were denied. A few were considered. None changed the outcome. The verdict held, not because it was perfect, but because it was sound. Time resumed its forward motion. The case drifted from headlines into archives, resurfacing only when anniversaries came around or when a new generation discovered it through documentaries and podcasts, voices narrating it with careful suspense, strangers debating motive and method as if distance could make the story lighter. The words "cold case solved" became shorthand, convenient, and incomplete. For the family, life reorganized itself. Emily's room was cleared, not erased, just transformed into memory instead of expectation. Her parents moved houses, a decision that felt like betrayal at first, and then like survival. Grief does not end. It migrates. It finds new rooms. The town changed too. New stores opened. Old buildings fell. The parking lot where the car was found was repaved, repainted, ordinary again in a way that felt unsettling. Teenagers heard the story secondhand, as warning, as legend. Fear softened into vigilance. Shock into history. Inside prison walls, the man at the center of it all faded into routine. No interviews. No statements. Just days measured by counts and meals, the attention gone, the silence no longer a weapon but a condition. Whatever remained unsaid stayed that way, sealed behind a sentence that removed incentive without erasing memory. Investigators met once more, informally, not to reopen the case, but to understand it. They spoke about evidence that almost vanished, about how close the truth came to staying buried, about the thin line between coincidence and convergence. Cold cases, they agreed, are not solved by brilliance but by refusal, the refusal to discard, to forget, to let time win by default. One moment lingered for all of them. During that prison interview, there had been a pause, a breath, where something more almost surfaced. It never did. And maybe that was the final lesson. Not every truth arrives whole. Not every story ends with full confession. Justice does not require completeness. It requires responsibility. On the 20th anniversary of Emily's disappearance, a small marker was placed near the creek. No dramatic inscription, just a quiet acknowledgement that a life had ended there and that it had taken too long to say so. People visited without ceremony. Some left flowers. Some just stood, listening to the water move past, indifferent and eternal. Cold cases do not end when verdicts are read. They end when silence is replaced with fact, when fear gives way to memory, when a community stops asking what happened and starts asking how to live differently because it did. And even then, something remains. A hum of streetlights at dusk. A car door left open. A moment that could have gone unnoticed, but didn't. Not forever. The truth waited. It endured. And when it finally surfaced, it did not shout. It simply refused to disappear again. Years later, when the paperwork had yellowed and the recordings were archived under numbers no one memorized anymore, the case still refused to sit quietly, lingering not in courtrooms or headlines but in the softer, harder places where resolution never fully reaches. Emily's name stopped appearing in news alerts, but it never stopped being spoken. It was said in classrooms when instructors talked about forensic breakthroughs and the patience of evidence. It was said in police academies when cold cases were taught not as failures, but as unfinished sentences. It was said in living rooms late at night by people who had grown up in that town and still checked their locks twice without knowing exactly why. The creek kept moving. Water rose and fell with the seasons, reshaping its banks, erasing and revealing without intention. Hikers passed nearby now, unaware of how close they were to a place that had once carried the weight of a life and a secret. Children skipped stones. Dogs pulled at leashes. The land accepted all of it without distinction. Emily's parents aged into a quieter version of grief. They stopped counting years since she disappeared and started counting years since she was found. The distinction mattered. One was waiting. The other was remembering. Holidays came and went. Some were harder than others. None were easy. They learned how to speak about her in the past tense without feeling like they were losing her again. They were asked sometimes if they felt at peace. They never answered directly. Peace implies an ending. What they had was something else, a settled truth, heavy but stable, something they could stand on without falling through. The not knowing had been replaced. That was enough. The man who killed her remained where the system put him. Appeals exhausted. Attention gone. Days repeating. His name faded into legal citations and footnotes, detached from the control it once carried. Whatever story he still held belonged only to him now, locked behind a future that no longer needed it. And maybe that was the final justice. Not the sentence. Not the verdict. But the transfer of power. The story no longer belonged to the person who caused it. It belonged to the truth, imperfect and incomplete, but real. Cold cases are often described as frozen. But this one was never frozen. It was buried. Pressed down by time, routine, distraction. And like all buried things, it changed under pressure, waiting for the moment when conditions were right to surface again. It took technology. It took stubbornness. It took people who refused to let an absence remain an answer. It took decades. And in the end, it did not resolve neatly. There was no single moment where everything made sense. No revelation that rewrote the past into something clean. What emerged was messier than that. Human. Fragmented. True. The community learned something uncomfortable from it. That evil does not always announce itself. That it can pass through quietly, rent rooms, shake hands, leave without spectacle. That safety is not guaranteed by familiarity. And that justice, when it comes late, still matters. Emily Carter did not become a symbol. She remained a person. A young woman who worked late, who planned for the future, who expected to get home. The case did not elevate her into abstraction. It returned her to reality, where loss is specific and irreplaceable. At night, when streetlights flicker on in that town, there are moments when the past feels close again, not threatening, just present. A reminder carried in muscle memory and caution. A reminder that some nights change everything, even if no one realizes it at the time. The cold case is closed. Not because every question was answered, but because the truth no longer has to hide. And that, in the end, is what solving a cold case really means: not restoring what was taken, not erasing what happened, but refusing to let time decide which stories are allowed to matter. The hum of the lights continues. The creek keeps moving. And the silence that once surrounded 1998 is no longer empty. Time does what courts cannot. It smooths edges without erasing them, carries weight without announcing it, and long after the case number stops meaning anything to anyone outside a filing system, its residue remains, settled into habits and instincts and the way people pause before saying a name that once dominated their lives. Part 12 of this story was never written in a courtroom. It unfolded quietly, in the years that followed, in places no camera followed and no transcript captured, because the aftermath of a cold case is not an event. It is a condition. Detectives who worked the case moved on. Some retired. Some transferred. Some took the lessons with them into new investigations, treating old evidence with a reverence they hadn't always known to give it before. When asked about Emily Carter in interviews or lectures, they spoke carefully, not with pride but with humility. They said the case taught them patience. They said it taught them restraint. They said it taught them that the most dangerous assumption is that silence means nothing is happening. In training rooms, recruits listened. They learned that cold cases are not dead cases. They learned that evidence does not expire just because attention does. They learned that time can be an accomplice or a witness depending on how you treat it. Emily's case became a reference point, not sensational, not mythic, just real. Outside law enforcement, the story settled into public consciousness differently. True crime audiences moved on quickly, chasing newer mysteries, fresher shocks. Algorithms stopped surfacing her name. Engagement dipped. The internet forgot in the way it always does, efficiently, without malice. But forgetting online did not mean forgetting everywhere. In that town, certain routines never fully returned to what they had been. Parents still waited up when teenagers worked late. Doors were still locked even on quiet streets. People still remembered the parking lot, even after it was rebuilt, even after nothing about it looked the same. Trauma does not need reminders. It builds its own. Emily's parents found a new rhythm. They volunteered with missing persons organizations, not as spokespersons but as listeners, people who understood how time stretches when answers don't come. They never offered platitudes. They never promised outcomes. They sat with families in that long, unbearable space between hope and dread, and they stayed there without trying to fix it. Sometimes they were asked if reopening the case had been worth it. They answered honestly. Yes, because not knowing was worse. Yes, because truth has weight, and weight grounds you. Yes, because even painful certainty allows grief to move instead of stagnate. Sometimes they were asked if they wished they'd never known the details. They didn't answer those questions. They visited the marker by the creek occasionally. Not often. Not ceremonially. Just when they felt the need to remind themselves that Emily was not a story anymore.
She was a place.
A reality. A fact. The water moved past the marker the same way it always had, unconcerned with meaning, carrying reflections and debris and light. They learned to accept that indifference was not cruelty. It was simply how the world continues. In prison, the man who had controlled the narrative for so long aged quietly.
His hair thinned.
His posture softened. He stopped filing paperwork once the system made it clear there was nowhere left to climb.
He spoke less.
He listened more. Whatever version of the story he still held remained unspoken, sealed behind a future that no longer required it. No deathbed confession came. No final revelation emerged to reframe the past. There was no twist waiting in the shadows. The truth had already done what it was going to do. Everything else was residue. And that, more than anything, became the final lesson of the case. Cold cases do not end with fireworks. They end with acceptance. Acceptance that some answers arrive incomplete. Acceptance that justice is a structure, not a salve. Acceptance that memory does not need perfection to matter. Years later, when someone new moved into that old neighborhood and asked about the story they'd heard in fragments, the answer came without drama. A young woman disappeared. It took a long time to find the truth.
They did.
And then the conversation moved on. That was the strangest part of all. Not that the case had been unsolved for so long, but that once it was solved, life learned how to carry it without stopping. That the world did not pause forever out of respect. That it kept going. Because that is what resolution really looks like. Not an ending. A continuation, with fewer questions. The streetlights still hum at dusk. The cars still pull into parking spaces and turn their engines off. Most nights end the way they're supposed to. And in the quiet space where a cold case once lived, there is now something else. Not peace, not relief, but understanding. The story no longer waits. It has taken its place. Understanding does not announce itself. It arrives slowly, almost invisibly, in the way people stop flinching at certain dates on the calendar, in the way a name can be spoken without the room going quiet afterward, in the way the past loosens its grip just enough for the present to breathe. Part 13 of this story lives in that space. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but deeply consequential. Years after the verdict, a box was found. Not hidden, not buried, just forgotten. It surfaced during a routine inventory at the old police headquarters, a building slated for renovation, its basement stacked with shelves no one had touched in years. Evidence long since digitized. Paper records from an era before redundancy meant safety. The box was mislabeled, its contents assumed transferred decades earlier. Inside were notebooks. Handwritten. Dated 1998. They belonged to one of the original detectives on Emily Carter's case, a man who had died years before the cold case was reopened, taking his doubts with him. His notes were not official reports. They were margins. Observations scribbled late at night. Questions no one had wanted to ask yet. Most of it was familiar. Witness, names, addresses. The dark sedan. The scream, no one could confirm. But tucked between pages was something that made the archivist pause, a rough sketch of a timeline that never made it into the formal file. A notation about a phone call placed from a payphone near the highway, early morning, the day after Emily disappeared. The call had gone nowhere. No recipient identified. No recording saved. In 1998, it had been written off as noise in a system full of it. But next to it, the detective had written one sentence, underlined twice. He's trying to decide what to do next. No name. Just that. The notes were reviewed quietly. Not because they would change anything legally, they wouldn't, but because cold cases have a way of continuing their work long after the courts are done with them. Investigators read the pages with a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. The instincts had been there from the beginning. Time had simply been louder. The notebooks were archived properly this time. Labeled.
Scanned.
Preserved. Not as evidence, but as record. As proof that even when answers are slow, questions are not always absent. Emily's parents were told. They listened, then asked a single question. Would it have changed anything? The answer was honest. Probably not.
Not then.
Not without the technology. Not without the patience that only years can teach. They nodded. They had made peace with the idea that timing is not morality. It is circumstance. The discovery didn't reopen wounds. If anything, it closed a small one. A quiet confirmation that from the very beginning, something in the room had known the truth was close, even if no one could reach it yet. Elsewhere, the story continued to ripple outward. A college student wrote a thesis on the case, focusing not on the crime but on the evolution of forensic persistence. A lab updated its evidence retention policies, citing Emily Carter as an example of why nothing should ever be considered exhausted. A detective delayed retirement to finish reviewing one last cold case, unwilling now to leave questions behind. None of these things made headlines. They didn't need to. This is how cold cases change the world, not through spectacle, but through calibration. Through small adjustments made by people who have learned what happens when patience runs out too early. The creek still ran. The marker still stood. Someone replaced the flowers once, anonymously. Someone else cleaned debris from around it after storm. No plaque announced who did it. No credit was claimed. The place had become shared ground, not sacred, just respected. Emily's name was no longer followed by qualifiers. Not missing, not presumed, not cold case. Just her name. In prison, the man who killed her received the news of the notebooks without reaction. It changed nothing for him. It was not supposed to. The truth no longer required his acknowledgement. Whatever fragments he still held belonged to a past that no longer needed completion. Silence, once his tool, had lost its value. And that may have been the final transformation of all. Because when a cold case is truly resolved, silence stops being powerful. It becomes inert. Just another absence, stripped of mystery. On certain nights, when the town is quiet and the air cools enough to carry sound farther than expected, there are moments when memory brushes up against routine. A car door closes. A radio plays a song from the late 90s. Someone pauses, just briefly, before continuing on. Not because they are afraid, because they remember. And remembrance, stripped of fear, stripped of speculation, is a different kind of weight. It does not drag you backward. It anchors you. Part 13 does not end with revelation. It ends with integration. A story once suspended between questions has settled into history, not as a warning shouted, but as a truth absorbed. The case is no longer waiting to be solved, or explained, or revisited. It has become part of how people understand time, how long it can hide something, how long it can carry it, and how, eventually, it gives it back. Quietly, relentlessly, without asking whether anyone is ready. By the time Part 14 arrives, the story no longer belongs to investigators or courts, or even the family who carried it the longest. It belongs to the space between people, the subtle ways a solved cold case reshapes how absence is understood, how certainty settles where speculation once lived. The town learned to live with a new kind of quiet. Not the brittle silence of fear, but the steadier quiet that comes after something heavy has been named. Sirens still cut through nights. Arguments still spilled out of bars. Life remained imperfect and loud when it needed to be. But the specific tension that had hovered since 1998, the sense that something unfinished was watching, began to loosen. No one marked the change. It simply happened. Local police noticed it first. Calls reporting suspicious behavior dropped slightly. Not because people were less cautious, but because caution no longer defaulted to panic. The story had taught the community something difficult but useful. Not every unknown is a threat, and not every threat announces itself. Discernment replaced dread. In schools, the case was mentioned less often. When it came up, it was no longer framed as a ghost story or a cautionary tale whispered between lockers. It was discussed plainly, almost clinically, as an example of how long truth can be delayed and still matter. Students who had never known Emily as a missing person absorbed her name as part of local history, not local fear. That shift mattered. It meant the story had stopped feeding on adrenaline. It had become something else, knowledge. Emily's parents felt the change in subtler ways. Strangers no longer approached them with the same urgency, the same need to say something profound. The look softened. Conversations returned to ordinary topics. Their daughter was no longer the center of every interaction. That hurt in ways they hadn't expected and healed them in others. They were finally allowed to be parents again, not symbols. They spoke about Emily differently now. Not only about how she died or how long it took to find her, but about small things. Her laugh. Her impatience with slow drivers. The way she always left cabinet doors open. These details, once buried beneath the weight of the case, resurfaced naturally, reclaiming space. The cold case had taken her way twice. Once physically, once narratively. Now, for the first time, she belonged fully to memory instead of mystery. Across the country, law enforcement quietly changed. Evidence rooms were reorganized. Retention schedules extended. Old boxes reopened not because of specific leads, but because Emily Carter's case had demonstrated something uncomfortable, that the difference between permanent loss and eventual truth can be nothing more than whether someone bothered to keep a thing. Patience became policy. Not everywhere, not perfectly, but enough to matter. Cold cases were no longer framed as embarrassments or failures. They were treated as debts, owed not urgency, but care. A subtle but profound shift, born not from legislation but from example. The media moved on. It always does. New cases filled the cycle. New mysteries competed for attention. Emily's story resurfaced occasionally, usually simplified, compressed into timelines and graphics. Solved after decades, the captions read, accurate but insufficient. Those who knew better didn't argue. They understood that no story survives retelling unchanged. What mattered was not how it was summarized, but that it had been resolved enough to resist distortion. Facts now anchored it. Silence no longer could. In prison, the man at the center of it all continued to fade. His world shrank to routine and repetition. Without uncertainty, without leverage, without the ability to withhold, he became ordinary in the most punishing way possible. Not infamous, not mysterious. Just another man whose choices had outlived him. No one waited for his version anymore. The story had moved on without it. That may have been the most unsettling outcome of all, the realization that the truth did not need completeness to be complete enough. That a cold case can resolve without satisfying every curiosity, without extracting every confession. Justice, it turned out, was not about total illumination. It was about removing the darkness that mattered most. On an evening thick with summer heat, years after everything had ended, a group of teenagers sat near the creek, music playing softly from a phone. They talked about nothing important. They laughed. Someone mentioned the marker nearby, casually, without reverence or fear. Yeah, someone said. Something happened there a long time ago. And that was it. No hushed tones. No dramatic pause. Just acknowledgement. The water kept moving. That is how part 14 ends, not with revelation, not with tragedy, but with normalization. The slow, almost invisible process by which a wound stops defining the body that carries it. The cold case had been solved. But more importantly, it had been absorbed into systems, into memory, into the quiet understanding that truth, even when delayed, changes the shape of what comes after. And life, indifferent and relentless, continued forward, slightly altered, slightly wiser, carrying the weight without collapsing under it. By the time part 15 unfolds, the case has stopped moving outward and begun to sink inward, into the places where stories become instincts, where lessons stop being spoken and start being lived. This is where aftermath becomes inheritance. The generation that grew up during the years Emily was missing begins to age into positions of authority. Teachers, city planners, patrol supervisors, parents. They carry the case with them not as a memory they revisit, but as a calibration they don't question. It shows up in how late shifts are staffed, in how evidence lockers are funded, in how no one laughs anymore when a file is labeled inactive instead of closed. Words matter now. They learn that from waiting. In town council meetings, when budgets are tight and someone suggests cutting archival storage or consolidating old records, another voice always pushes back. Not loudly, not emotionally, just firmly. Because everyone understands what is really being discussed, even if no one says her name. The case taught them that neglect has consequences that don't announce themselves for decades. And once you know that, you don't unknow it. Emily's parents grow older, slower, but steadier. Their lives are quieter now, less defined by obligation. They stop giving interviews entirely. They stop attending conferences. They choose privacy not as retreat, but as boundary. They have done what they needed to do. The rest belongs to time. On certain evenings, they still talk about the years she was missing. Not with anger, with disbelief. How long it took. How strange it was to live inside a question. How every ring of the phone once felt like a verdict. They talk about how absence has its own gravity, how it bends everything around it, even joy. And then they talk about other things, because they can. That, more than anything, is how healing announces itself, not with relief, but with permission. The marker by the creek remains. Weathered now, the edges softened by seasons. Someone has scratched initials into the back, carelessly, years ago. Someone else tried to clean it off. The attempt failed. The mark stayed. No one removes it. It becomes part of the object's truth. A reminder that memory is not pristine. It is touched, altered, claimed by different hands for different reasons. Still meaningful. Still standing. The creek floods one winter, higher than it has in years. For a brief moment there is concern. News crews come. The marker disappears under brown, rushing water. Social media lights up with anxious speculation. Has something been lost again? When the water recedes, the marker is still there. Tilted slightly.
Scarred.
Intact. People breathe out without realizing they were holding their breath. It is not the marker they are relieved about. It is the fear of losing ground. In prisons, policies shift quietly. Inmates with long, unresolved cases are interviewed differently now. Not with pressure, not with promises, but with patience. Silence is no longer treated as a challenge to be broken, but as information to be contextualized. Investigators understand now that time can loosen things in ways force never will. Emily's case becomes part of that training. Not sensationalized. Referenced. A benchmark. The man who killed her ages into irrelevance. Health issues. Transfers. Paperwork. He is moved farther from the center of the story each year, until eventually his name surfaces only when required by record. There is no reckoning moment. No final confrontation. Just attrition. His silence ends not with confession, but with insignificance. And that, in the end, is how power leaves. The media revisits the case once more on a round-number anniversary. A long-form piece. Balanced. Respectful. It frames the story not as a triumph, but as a warning about patience and preservation. It avoids dramatization. It resists the urge to simplify. It does well. People read it quietly. Then they move on. That is the final transition, the moment when a story no longer demands attention to survive. When it can exist without being constantly reinforced. Emily's name settles into history. Not forgotten. Integrated. At night, the town looks like any other. Streetlights. Windows. Cars passing through intersections without slowing down. The place where fear once lived is now just geography again. That doesn't mean nothing happened there. It means what happened no longer controls what happens next. Cold cases are often described as ghosts. But this one was not a haunting. It was a weight. And now that weight has been distributed, across systems, across memory, across generations, it no longer crushes. It instructs. Part 15 ends not with an echo, but with balance. The truth has found its scale. Not everything is known. Not everything is healed. But nothing is hidden. And that is how the story finally stops moving forward. Not because it has nowhere to go, but because it has arrived where it belongs. By part 16, the story has thinned out, not weakened but refined, like something worn smooth by years of being carried. What remains is not the crime itself, not even the investigation, but the quiet afterimage, the way a resolved cold case continues to alter perception long after it stops being discussed. This is where the story becomes internal. For those who lived through 1998, memory no longer arrives as a surge. It comes sideways. A smell of asphalt after rain. A late-night news jingle from an old television. A car idling too long in a parking lot. These moments don't trigger fear anymore. They trigger recognition. The body remembering what the mind has already placed in context. That distinction matters. Fear freezes. Recognition informs. People who once double-checked their doors now do so, without thinking about why. Parents who once waited up now send a text instead. The behaviors remain, but the tension has drained out of them. What was once a reaction has become a habit, and habits, unlike fear, don't exhaust you. The town no longer introduces itself through the case. Visitors come and go without hearing the story unless they ask. When they do, the answer is measured, almost understated. Yes, something terrible happened. Yes, it took a long time to resolve. No, it doesn't define the place anymore. That shift is subtle, but it is the difference between a scar and a wound. In law enforcement circles, Emily's case reaches a kind of quiet maturity. It stops being cited as an example of breakthrough and starts being referenced as infrastructure, a reminder of why evidence storage matters, why patience matters, why certainty should never be rushed. New cases benefit from that legacy without ever touching it directly. Files are handled with more care. Assumptions are challenged earlier. Silence is interrogated without being provoked. The system does not become perfect. It becomes humbler. Emily's parents feel this phase more than anyone. The attention has fully receded now. No calls. No requests. No anniversaries marked by strangers. At first, the quiet felt like erasure. Then it revealed itself as something else. Space. Space to age without an audience. Space to remember without explanation. They visit the creek less often. Not because it hurts, because it no longer needs to. The marker remains, but it has stopped functioning as a focal point. It is part of the landscape now, like a bend in the path or a stand of trees. Meaning does not require proximity anymore. It travels with them. They talk sometimes about who Emily would have been. Not hypothetically, not with longing, but with curiosity. Would she have stayed nearby? Would she have moved away? Would she have laughed at how serious everyone became? These questions are no longer cruel. They are gentle. They exist without demanding answers. That is a kind of mercy. In prison, time continues its unremarkable work. The man responsible grows older, slower, quieter. He is transferred again, farther from the place where his name once carried weight. New inmates don't recognize it. Guards don't react to it. His past no longer precedes him. This is not redemption. It is diminishment. And for someone who once relied on secrecy and control, diminishment is the final loss. There are no revelations left. No hidden letters. No confessions waiting for the right moment. The story has given everything it is going to give. What remains is interpretation, and interpretation belongs to the living. Years later, a young officer pulls an old file during training, flipping through scanned documents, pausing at a familiar name. They recognize it not from fear, but from instruction. They know how the case ends. They know how long it took. They close the file with a quiet resolve they don't yet have language for. That resolve will guide decisions they don't realize are connected. This is how cold cases continue, not as mysteries, but as influences. The night remains ordinary. Streetlights hum. Windows glow. Cars move through intersections without hesitation. Somewhere, water runs over stone, indifferent and constant. The world does not pause to honor the past. It absorbs it and keeps going. That, in the end, is the truest aftermath. Not closure, not justice as spectacle, but continuity, altered just enough to matter. Part 16 does not end with a lesson spelled out. It ends with a condition, a world that has learned, quietly, what it costs to ignore absence, and what it gains by refusing to let time decide which truths survive. The case is finished. Its influence is not. And that is where the story finally rests, not in silence, not in noise, but in the steady, unremarkable flow of life that now carries truth instead of questions.